I wrote myself a check for $10 million for acting services rendered, and I gave myself 5 years, or 3 years maybe, and I dated it Thanksgiving 1995, and I put it in my wallet, and I kept it there, and it deteriorated and stuff, but then just before Thanksgiving 1995, I found out that I was going to make $10 million on.
There's a piece of paper that shouldn't exist. It was written before the career, before the fame, before anyone in Hollywood knew the name or wanted the face. It had a date on it, Thanksgiving, 1995. It had an amount, $10 million, and it had a memo line that read, "For acting services rendered." The man who wrote it had nothing, no major credits, no guarantee, no logical reason to believe that number would ever be real. But he didn't write it as a wish. He didn't write it as a prayer. He wrote it as a fact, one that simply hadn't arrived yet. That man was Jim Carrey. In 1990, Jim Carrey was living out of his car. He had moved to Los Angeles years earlier with a father who believed in him and almost nothing else. His stand-up work was inconsistent. His acting career hadn't broken through. By his own account, he would drive up to Mulholland Drive at night, alone, and sit looking down at the city lights spread out below him. He wasn't doing it to feel sorry for himself. He was doing it to visualize. Every night he would sit in that car on that hill and tell himself that directors wanted him, that producers were calling, that the work he hadn't yet done was already being recognized. He created the feeling of success before success existed, and he held it there, in the dark, above a city that hadn't noticed him yet. Then, in 1992, he wrote the check. $10 million, dated 3 years into the future. He folded it and kept it in his wallet, not as a reminder of what he wanted, but as a confirmation of what he had already decided. Just before Thanksgiving 1995, the exact date written on that check, he received his payment for Dumb and Dumber. The amount, $10 million. This is not a coincidence story. This is a story about what happens when a mind refuses to operate from its current circumstances and chooses instead to operate from its chosen destination. Jim Carrey didn't predict the future. He constructed it, from the inside out, years before the outside world caught up. You already know what you want. The image exists somewhere. The version of your life that feels right, the work that matters, the person you're moving toward becoming. You've seen it. Maybe just in flashes. Maybe only in the quiet moments before you fall asleep, when the noise of the day stops and something underneath gets to speak. But then morning comes, and the gap between where you are and where you want to be feels less like a road and more like a wall. So you do what most people do. You wait. You wait for the evidence. You wait for the circumstances to align. You wait for someone to give you permission to start believing in the direction you've already chosen. And while you wait, the version of yourself that knows exactly who it's supposed to become sits there. Patient, silent, and increasingly distant. The question is not whether you know where you're going. The question is whether you're willing to live from that destination before you've arrived. This is the law of assumption, not motivation, not positive thinking, not affirmation. Something older and more precise than all of those. The law of assumption states that your reality is not shaped by your circumstances. It is shaped by the state you occupy. The identity you assume, the feelings, the beliefs, the self-image you inhabit on a daily basis, acts as the template that experience fills. Assume the state of the person you intend to become, completely and consistently, and reality reorganizes itself around that assumption. The check wasn't the technique. The check was the anchor for the state. Here is why this works, and why it has nothing to do with magic. The brain does not distinguish cleanly between a vividly imagined experience and a real one. Neurologically, the same regions activate. The same emotional signatures fire. When you hold an internal state consistently, when you feel, with specificity and repetition, the emotions of the version of yourself you're becoming, your nervous system begins to treat that state as baseline. Your perception shifts. Your behavior aligns. Your decisions, moment to moment, are made from the perspective of someone who already inhabits that reality. Think of it this way: a compass doesn't move the terrain, but it changes every step you take. The law of assumption doesn't rearrange the world around you, it rearranges you. And that rearrangement changes everything you notice, everything you pursue, and everything you're willing to do to get there. Jim Carrey wasn't pretending. He was calibrating. Every night on that hill, every time he touched that check in his wallet, he was training his nervous system to operate from arrival rather than from lack. The check is the famous story, but the practice was daily. Carrey has spoken extensively about his nightly ritual on Mulholland Drive, not as a one-time event, but as a consistent discipline practiced over years. He would visualize specific scenarios, directors requesting him by name, sets where he was working, the physical sensation of performing at a level he hadn't yet reached. He wasn't hoping. He was rehearsing, in the only space where rehearsal was available to him at the time, his own mind. When Ace Ventura released in 1994 and made him a household name, the external world finally caught up with the internal one he had been inhabiting for years. The destination had existed long before the arrival. The philosopher Neville Goddard spent decades mapping this exact mechanism. In his framework, consciousness is not a passenger in your life. It is the architect. He wrote that the world is a mirror of your most dominant assumptions, and that changing your life requires not effort directed outward, but a shift in the state you occupy inward. Modern psychology has arrived at adjacent territory through different doors. Research in mental simulation, specifically the work of psychologists studying motor imagery and behavioral rehearsal, shows that holding a future state with emotional and sensory specificity accelerates the alignment of behavior toward that state. The brain, given a clear internal model, begins navigating toward it below the threshold of conscious intention. Assumption isn't optimism, it's architecture. But this wasn't limited to one moment in Jim Carrey's life. The same principle showed up again, in a completely different context, and the pattern it reveals is impossible to ignore. By 2014, Jim Carrey had everything the check promised and more. The career had delivered. The name was global. The money had long since surpassed that handwritten number from Mulholland Drive. By any external measure, the assumption had worked. The state he inhabited in that car, above that city, had become his reality. And then he stood in front of the graduating class of Maharishi University of Management and said something that most people in his position never say.
Bennett.
He told them that his father had played it safe his entire life, had taken the secure job, had set aside his dream of being a comedian, and had been laid off anyway. The thing his father feared had happened regardless of the sacrifice made to avoid it. The risk of following the dream, Carrey said, is no greater than the risk of abandoning it. You might as well take the chance on what you love. But then he went further. He talked about the self he had constructed, the identity of Jim Carrey the star, and how even that had to be released. He spoke about consciousness itself, about the mask versus the face beneath it, about how the law of assumption, taken to its deepest level, is not about acquiring things. It is about discovering what you are when nothing needs to be acquired. He was still practicing, just at a different depth. In the early years, the assumption was, I am the actor who earns $10 million. By 2014, the assumption had evolved. I am something prior to all of that, and I need to know what that is. The same man, the same principle, two completely different contexts, one material, one existential, and the pattern identical in both. He refused to wait for the outside world to tell him who he was. He decided first. Then he lived from that decision. What the Mulholland Drive years and the Maharishi speech reveal together is that the law of assumption is not a tool for getting things. It is a tool for becoming, and that becoming never stops. Carey used it to build a career. Then he used it to see past the career entirely. The principle doesn't have a ceiling, only the depth at which you're willing to apply it. Now that you understand what this principle is, how Jim Carrey lived it, and why it showed up in every chapter of his life, the real question is what you do with it starting today. Most people set goals as external targets, the number, the title, the result. The law of assumption requires something different. Identify the state, the emotional and psychological experience of the person who has already arrived. What does that person feel when they wake up? How do they carry themselves? What is their relationship to uncertainty, to effort, to their own future? Write it down with precision. Not what you want to have, what you want to be. That is the state you are going to begin occupying. Carrey used a check. The object itself wasn't magical. Its function was to interrupt his current state thinking and pull him back into the assumed state, repeatedly throughout his day. Choose your anchor deliberately. It can be an object, a written statement, a place you return to, a ritual you perform at the same time each day. What matters is consistency. Every time you encounter the anchor, you return, fully, emotionally, to the state you've assumed. Not as performance, as practice. This is the distinction that separates the law of assumption from ordinary goal setting. You do not act toward the future self. You act from it. Now, today, in every decision available to you. Ask the question Carrey implicitly asked every night on that hill. What would the person I've already decided to become do here? Then do that. The state precedes the action. The action deepens the state. The cycle, maintained long enough, produces the reality. Jim Carrey held a check for $10 million in his wallet for years. Not because he needed the reminder, because he had already decided, and the check was the daily proof of a decision the world hadn't confirmed yet. The question is not whether you believe the law of assumption works. The question is whether you're willing to occupy your destination before you have any reason to. Most people wait for evidence. The rare ones manufacture the state, and then watch the evidence follow. You already know which kind of person writes the check. The only question left is whether you're willing to date it. If this changed the way you see your own mind, there's more where this came from.